Sometimes when you're driving down the road all by yourself, you begin to hear a voice that tells you need to look around, pay attention, maybe something isn't quite right. That voice is me. It's the voice of Gord. Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to another episode of Voice of Gord. Bringing you today a live stream that we recorded in the week before the July 4th weekend. The boys at the Logistics Lounge, Pedro Potato and Hunter, very graciously allowed me to use their platform to bring you the one and only Steve Viscelli, author of Big Rig, Trucking and the Decline of the American Dream. I've been trying to get Steve on the show since before I started it. Steve is an excellent documentarian of what's gone on with the economics of the American trucking industry over the last couple of decades. Highly recommend his book. Again, Big Rig, Trucking and the Decline of the American Dream. As I mentioned on the show, you've probably heard Steve on Lex Fridman or possibly on NPR. That fella gets around. Steve is working on many projects involving trucking, and I was very happy to discuss all of those with him. This is a little bit of a long one. It's over 2 hours, so pack a lunch. And if after that you still find yourself wanting more, I appeared with Steve on another podcast that's now defunct called What's Left, hosted by my good friend Oliver Bateman. You'll find him on Twitter at MustacheClubUS. Also a very prodigious writer. Oliver hosted Steve and I to discuss his book and the trucking business a couple of years ago. And there's another episode of What's Left that's just myself and Oliver. Oliver has very kindly given me the files to those two episodes, which I'm going to repost here on Voice of Gord as bonus content for the summer. Hopefully those will be out very soon. But in the meantime, I'm really happy to bring you Steve Viscelli. Very, very grateful to Hunter and Pedro for hosting, for Justin Martin, SuperTrucker on Twitter, formerly of Freightwaves, for helping quarterback the show. And I hope you guys enjoy this. Lots of stuff going on in this one. And who knows, maybe I'll do another live stream sometime soon. I'll have all the links for all the boys and Steve and his book and his various research in the show notes. Any comments, feel free to get a hold of me, gordilocks at protonmail.com. And if you haven't already, head on over to Substack, the great platform for deeper dives and awesome writing. You can find me there at autonomoustruckers.substack.com. A little later this week, I'll be recording with previous guests, Scott Douglas and Will Cook of America Without Drivers. We're going to take a little look at some interesting developments in trucking and what we can maybe see on the horizon south of the Chevron deference decision here with the Supreme Court. Some very interesting stuff we're anticipating with that. And you'll never miss an episode if you subscribe over at autonomoustruckers.substack.com. All right, thanks for listening, and let's get to it.
We are here on this special edition of the Logistics Lounge. It's Monday. It's midday. We're never on at this time, but here we are. We have an incredible day lined up for you guys. We have Gord McGill with the Voice of Gord, and he's going to interview Mr. Steve down here. And Gord, take it away.
All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another fantastic edition of the Voice of Gord podcast, live streaming this time, with help from the boys at the Logistics Lounge. Thank you so much, Mr. Potato and Hunter. And a very special guest today. When I started doing my podcast and writing on autonomoustruckers.substack.com, one of the very first people I had front of mind to bring on the show was Mr. Steve Viscelli, author, researcher, sociology professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and someone who's spent most of his adult life studying the trucking business. His book, Big Rig, Trucking and the Decline of the American Dream, came out in 2016. You may also have seen Steve on the Lex Fridman podcast and numerous times on NPR, where Steve seems to be their go-to guy for all questions trucking and trucking labor market economics. So, Steve, thank you very much for coming on.
Hey, it's awesome to be here, Gord.
Sweet. And we are catching you in your home office in Old Forge, New York.
Yeah, that's right. Right up in the middle of the Adirondacks.
Yeah, fellow upstater.
Yeah,
so
I love upstate New York.
Yeah. All right. So can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, your sort of academic pedigree, and your journey to studying the trucking industry?
Yeah, so I it's been a long journey and sort of an accidental one. I didn't really have much experience or knowledge of the trucking industry when I first started studying it. My dad worked at the same factory for like 40 years, and he used to run the truck scale. And so I would, go in, see him at work, and he'd always be talking to one driver or another. Always had a lot of great stories about drivers. And then in college, I had a summer job working loading furniture for United Vanways, and then would ride along with guys for 3 or 4 hours, and then help unload. Did that sort of thing, and then was in graduate school in sociology. Had a whole other dissertation planned on labor and environmental coalitions, and happened to be reading all the literature about how you get people to work hard, and saw all this stuff about how you had to manage people and supervise them and monitor people, and was going home for the holidays one Christmas, and saw all these drivers. Just recently read a book about truckers, and then read Mike Belzer's book Sweatshops on Wheels. And I thought, here are all these people who work super hard. Wages have been going down. Things are getting harder and harder for drivers. Like, I wonder how drivers actually think about that. And like a week before that, I read this article in like Popular News about satellite tracking of trucks and how they were using GPS to kind of monitor the trucks. And I thought, there's got to be a lot happening here. And just all of a sudden, realized, this is what I gotta study. And here I am 20 some years later, wrote a dissertation on deregulation and how it affected drivers. Started to do a bunch of policy work around wage and hours and efficiency. Now I'm at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm an economic sociologist. Spent 20 years now talking to hundreds of drivers, looking at just about every bit of data or that could give me some insight into what has happened to the job and labor markets in trucking over the last 40 or 50 years or so. And and it's meant meeting a whole bunch of really cool folks like yourself. I was just trying to remember how we ever started talking about trucking. Do you recall? I know it's been a few years.
I'm pretty forward guy. I probably just found your email address somehow and just cold called you.
I
got a hold of your book, which I've read a couple of times now, and because I as well am very interested in why the trucking industry functions the way that it does. And yes, Richie, we can see the comments. Please, everyone, fire your questions forward and I'll answer them as best I can, or Steve will. But, and I have the benefit of having seen how the business functions in other countries and was curious about why something which is so similar can operate so radically differently in different places. Now, part of that's culture, part of it's geography, part of its regulatory environments. And, your book came out and I was really interested in it. If I may, the Big Rig, Trucking and the Decline of the American Dream, one of the sort of primary focuses of that book is sort of critique of the lease operator model. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I do. I mean, the immediate question, as I was saying, what really interested me was I knew this, this decline in wages had been happening, right? And I just thought this has got to be apparent to drivers, right? And I wanted to know, and I knew the story of deregulation in sort of broad strokes, and I thought this is clearly a policy issue. It was about deregulation, it was about deunionization, and then this plummet in wages. And I thought drivers must have noticed that this happened. Like, how are they thinking about it? How do they understand what happened, and what can they do about it? And then then I got an education really quickly when I got out there. So the first thing I did, because I knew that I had to understand, from the driver's perspective, what was happening, was I went out and I got a job, as a long haul driver for 6 months. And very quickly I realized, I don't even know what questions to ask, because you kind of get out there and you realize, like, yeah, the drivers that I thought would have seen this and understand it in a certain way, and I want to know how they understand it. Turns out a lot of them just got in a truck 6 weeks ago or 6 months ago, right? So I started to, understand the different segments of the market and the way turnover was affecting them. And then very quickly, within, weeks of being on the road, I realized that there was this whole other category of driver who was oftentimes doing exactly the same job as I was, right? I mean, for the same company, and they considered themselves an owner operator, and I knew that, what independent owner operators were. And I had met some, like I said, when I was a kid, and sort of, knew that there were sort of small business truckers out there, but didn't realize that there was a whole other category of driver that was working for big carriers, right, and leasing the trucks from them, et cetera. And that ended up being really fascinating for me, because it encapsulated the central questions I had about, really, how do people understand the labor market, how they go about making a living for themselves, providing for their families. And then, of course, the big questions in the book revolve around, how are employers able to impact policy, right? Shape policy, and then also shape the way that workers understand the labor market and their opportunities in a way that, advantages those employers potentially and allows them to change the norms, right, around driving. And so the book traces the development of the lease purchase program in particular. Folks who may not have much or any experience in the industry, who get in, are convinced to essentially pay the operating costs of the truck that they're driving. And so that became sort of the prime story that I wanted to
Right. An anecdote I'd like to share about that sort of lease purchase model. I got started trucking, like, at one time, the way most people did was through small family operations. Often guys get into trucking via farming. I worked for a small family company that at one time my uncle worked for, at various times my dad had worked for. And my boss, a gentleman by the name of Scott Paddock, he and I were at the, I can't remember if it was called the Canadian Truck Show or the Toronto International Truck Show. But it was up in Toronto by the airport, big convention center in Mississauga. And one of these large carriers in Canada, with their own in-house truck driving school, had this huge sign, out in front of their display at the truck show saying, "Sign up with us and we will make you your own boss in 90 days. And my boss, Scott Paddock, who has been living and breathing trucking his entire life, just looked at it and looked at that and said, "These guys are scumbags." Right? Because he knows you can't just like grab people off the street and expect them to have the necessary business acumen and the necessary experience to undertake something like buying and operating your own truck in 3 months. Like this, like he knew the scam was a scam from the word go.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's funny sometimes that, I'll be reading, I serve as an expert witness in wage and hour cases that drivers bring, alleging misclassification and then, making claims on wages that they're owed. And oftentimes the way that the big carriers will present themselves, joke is kind of like they make themselves sound not like a big trucking company out to make profits, but like a small business incubator or something. It's like they're setting up thousands of people to be small business people every year, and of course the failure rate of those programs is tremendous, right? And we have trouble getting data to get precise numbers on these things, but at some of the bigger carriers, we may see, 95% failure rate. And by success, they mean that you continue to pay the truck for whatever the term of the lease was. Success is not, you're walking away with a truck with a bunch of equity in it and you're then sort of getting your own operating authority and, moving on.
Right.
Success literally means you keep paying the bills there. Gord, do you mind? Ricardo's asking about drayage in the comments there. I'd like to, you mind if we pick up on some of that?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So, so one of the things that, you mentioned you might want to talk about is some work that I just did out in California. So, the state was, during the, supply chain crisis was asked by the ag, segment or the ag industry, like if they could change the rules about how much weight they could allow on trucks, right? Because they were they're always looking to do that, and so this gave the driver shortage gave them the a reason to ask again to increase the weight that they put on the trucks. So the state wanted to know what it could do around policy, for recruitment, training, retention of drivers. And so five of the state agencies, DMV, Ag, Labor, the governor's business office, and then who's the fifth? Transportation, had me go out and do some work interviewing drivers, doing observations in ag. And one of the places that we went, because we heard there were lots of problems getting exports out, was to the ports of LA and Long Beach, Oakland as well. We had some data from Oakland, but we went down to LA and Long Beach and attempted to survey the drivers, made contact with about 500 drayage drivers down there. And as Ricardo pointed out, the vast majority of them are contractors. But what really struck me was how many of them were immigrants and were not native English speakers. And this presents a whole additional layer, and I'm probably jumping ahead in the conversation here, but it's something that's really struck me over the last few years, and probably your listeners as well, is that a lot of the industry right now feels like the Wild West, and like there's just companies operating completely illegally, just ignoring the rules about labor and classifying people as well as safety. But the workforce is also becoming more vulnerable to those practices. So these drivers down there in the ports, a lot of them are not native English or even Spanish speakers, or can read the legalese of these contracts, right? If there is even a contract, right? And so a lot of these, drivers come in and they're looking for a decent paying job, and they're told, here's how you work at the ports of LA and Long Beach. You pay for the truck that you drive, and sign here, and we'll set you up. And most of them have no experience driving in the United States at all, don't know what the condition of that truck is, what it's going to cost to operate that truck, let alone the maintenance history of it, et cetera. And so these lease purchase, plans that I, talk about in the book that are largely large carrier ones, when you get into some segments of the market like drayage, we see this beast just becoming a whole, more gruesome monster, in other segments.
Right. So you have some critics.
No.
There's a few people I've bumped into over the years, and even this morning when I was planning the show, who, they take some umbrage to your sort of criticism of this lease operator model. And, they're typically like your boomer-con pro-business people, which I support. Like I come from libertarian world, and I think people should be able, largely speaking, to do what they want. But one of the things that's said in your book, and that like I've come to find out in other study and reading other people's books and reading Belzer, is that one of the things Belzer says in Sweatshops on Wheels is that we have this problem with viewing things as basically regulation versus deregulation. And one of the things he says in his book is that it was merely a transfer of regulation in a couple of different ways, right? So we go from the government setting rates and controlling who can enter the business, which there's a case to be made that an adjustment to that was necessary. But what's happened, and you totally see this as a driver, is all the regulation is now on you. We got ELDs, the government's tracking your every move, companies left, right, and center are putting driver-facing cameras in. Part of this is downstream of the insurance business being like, wow, it is the Wild West, and we have a lot of idiots putting their trucks upside down in ditches and getting in accidents and nuclear verdicts because the industry itself is not actually doing the free market thing of controlling like who gets to enter and policing itself. And so the government has taken the regulation and just moved it into the driver's seat. And it seems like that's still not working because as after the implementation of the ELD mandate, aggressive driving and speeding tickets have gone up. Accidents have increased, not decreased. So we have this whole mess here. And I think some of the people who are critics of your book, they get fixated. Maybe it's because you go on NPR or whatever and everything gets slotted into like conservative versus liberals, good guy, bad guy, whatever. But if you dig into the details of your book, like what you're saying, I believe, is that we had the transfer of regulation, deregulation, whatever you want to call it, and a coping mechanism that the industry has come up with, one of many, to get drivers is to offer them this like carrot. Hey, you can become your own boss, but then they don't adequately prepare you for what that means.
Yeah, I do. I mean, and I think I picked up on that same part of Belzer's book there about, what that deregulation really just resulted in us re-regulating the industry in other ways. And I think the more time I spend talking to folks and sort of witnessing, firsthand how the industry is regulated, the more I agree with that point, right? Because it's like because the in my opinion, and I've been doing a lot of work on compensation and safety and other issues recently in turnover. The safest driver is a well-compensated, experienced driver who's in control of their hours and the work that they're doing. And, those were exactly the drivers who were driven out of the industry, right? And driven into, simply the better paying segments of it or becoming independents because of deregulation. And then we ended up with, this incredible turnover. So, the first thing that we had to do was come up in the 80s was come up with a bunch of regulations for how you train and certify new truck drivers. Because the turnover had become so bad, you needed this, rapid expansion of truck driving schools. Now, again, the critics will say like, oh, there were truck driving schools before, but before deregulation. And sure, there were, some truck driving schools, but you didn't have the sort of massive churn that we do today. Like, and we've been trying to get a handle on these numbers, but even the ATA's numbers, and I think you and I have talked about this in the past, their own shortage report shows that we've got 10 million people with CDLs in the United States. Now that's of all classes, right? A, B, and C. But we only have 3.5 million jobs that require a CDL, right? So, and that 3-to-1 ratio we see over and over again of people who are holding the license to jobs that require the license. And so because deregulation created this, just pulled the bottom, out from the rug out from underneath the labor market, we had this huge churn. Now that created a whole bunch of need just in the area of safety around training, right? And CDL issuance, you had to have all these new regulations. So now we've got the entry level driver training, regulations are the most recent version. But then, of course, you had to, add on these additional layers of, safety regulation, et cetera, to try to fix the crashes. Hours of service, right, being the one that drivers are most concerned with. So I completely agree with Belzer's point that, essentially the regulation shifted. Now, where did it go? Right. Right. It went into the operational regulation, which used to often be handled by a contract. Right. So, why didn't you have to worry about drivers, driving themselves to death? Well, it was because, most of them were governed by a Teamster contract, or were working for a company that looked at that contract and said, hey, at least we got to try to follow the general, framework of that. But the other thing I've been thinking a lot about recently is, and I handle some of this in the book, is just, the way that the industry then gets to use that new regulatory scheme and architecture to sort of favor those who can have the greatest influence on that policy. And again, here, electronic logs are the best example. So the big carriers, right, who were proponents of that, they already largely worked around that, around those restrictions, because they had onboard, automatic onboard recorders, right? AOBRs as they were called. And so they were largely operating under a 14-hour window already. And but they had to, right? Because they had these inexperienced drivers who, they didn't want to trust to sort of, start and stop, at random times. And so, that influence too, as the shift of that regulation away from economic regulation, right? And away from that essentially private regulation of the contracts of the Teamsters towards safety, right? And other areas of policy, gives this additional lever, right, to these big players who can, have big influences on those areas. And so it becomes yet another important step in, creating the experience that drivers have of being, under the thumb of these regulations in a labor market where they're not.
Yeah, and while we're here and on that subject, shout out to Karen Levy at Cornell with her book Data Driven Truckers, Technology, and the New Workplace Surveillance, which I recommend every trucker go and read, because it's a trope on Twitter, digital Satan. We have this person controlling our lives. Well, one of Steve's fellow academics also spent a decade investigating this and is on our side about it. And you guys need to go read that book.
Yeah. And, just to sort of, since the technology, issue has now been raised, I think that's where we've seen so much already, right, of this, and Karen's work's, fantastic on this. And, we're here all the time in the public policy debate, like, oh, what about, self-driving trucks, and what about all stuff? And, it's not this, wholly new thing that technology is going to affect the lives of truck drivers, right? I mean, and people ask me all the time, like, why are truck drivers so, afraid of self-driving trucks and new technology? Like, why do they seem resistant to it? And what I say is, because they've seen this stuff already. Like, we've seen 40 years of technological change starting, it goes all the way back, of course, but, just in the modern era, start with satellite linked computers and GPS and what that has allowed companies to do, and the way that it's de-skilled the job. When I learned to drive a truck, first of all, it was manual, right? And people like, big sexy, technology like self-driving trucks, but, an automatic transmission is a technology, right? And it's had a big impact on who can drive that truck and what you have to pay them. Now you get into, satellite linked computers, ELDs, forward collision avoidance, all these other technologies, right, that have effectively de-skilled the job and opened it up so that, you can't have that turnover at the rates that we do now without automatic transmissions, right? Because it just takes that much time.
Right. Well, the very first thing I ever wrote and had published on the internet at this little blog called glibertarians.com, shout out Glebs, The subtitle of it was, I think I can't remember the exact title, but it was something like, never mind the robots, the state is already trying to roboticize the driver. Like, and Karen has a chapter in her book on this called The Slope. Like, what are we going to do with all these people who you are trying to replace with robots at some point in the future? And what's happening is you're treating them like robots in the meantime. And I think we all can agree that's extremely objectionable. Speaking of automated trucks, some of your other work in the background has been investigating the implementation of this technology, the narratives around it. Can you speak to some of that and what you've been doing?
Yeah, so I've been this came right out of the publication of the book, which was 2016, a while ago now. But that was right around the time when Uber was developing early stages of developing their first self-driving truck. And there just happened to be a Penn grad who worked there, and he saw the book and he invited me out to give a talk. And it was a crowd of engineers, right, who had didn't have much understanding of what trucking was. And so they asked me to come out and present on the book, and what made truckers' lives difficult and how this technology might make their lives better. And that actually ended up just getting me into this whole world of Silicon Valley. And I initially was going to write my next book on Silicon Valley as sort of work, right? And the engineering teams and sort of how they thought about the world and navigated their labor market and all that. But trucking, always pulls you back in. But the end result, the sort of what ended up happening was I've spent the last 6 or 7 years, talking to the engineers, taking rides in these self-driving trucks. Around 2018, I guess it was 2 years after that, I published the first piece of that work, which is called Driverless ? And it was about the future of the American trucker, autonomous trucks, and the future of the American trucker. And I guess I'll try to keep my ego in check here, but that was 6 years ago or so. And I think the basic analysis in that of what the impact might be in the over the next few decades still holds up, which says something about the kind of insight I think you get from understanding the work that drivers are actually doing and sort of focusing on that like sort of labor process. Like most of the analyses that we see of the impact of self-driving trucks say, okay, let's assume these things can replace truckers and then, pick a slope of adoption and a starting point, and we'll just make all the trucking jobs go to, 0 or 20%. And that will be the, how we sort of predict the impact. And I took a very different approach. I basically said, look, here, I went in, I talked to the engineers. I said, what will these things be able to do as you imagine it? And like, what are the limitations going to be? And once they had sort of explained it to me, over and over and over again, I said, well, here are the segments of the trucking industry, and here are the parts of the work that drivers do in those segments that, might fit what the capabilities of this truck are. And then I sort of, did some addition and subtraction, based on industry numbers to try to understand how many jobs might be at risk if these things ended up being able to do what the companies thought they would do. And so that's been, 6 years now of sort of taking those scenarios and taking them out into the world and having people tell me I'm right or wrong, and and further in these conversations. Let me just wrap this up by saying, but the big takeaway for me in this whole debate around technology, as I think Karen would agree, is that policy is going to shape this, right? So the technology does not come out of the earth with implications for and consequences for for workers sort of pre-baked in, right? It's a matter of the economics, of course, that they're going to be, adopted, of the industry that they're going to be adopted in. But policy shapes this stuff, right? What are the safety rules? What does it mean for hours of service? What are the hours of service rules? What are the labor rules? And I'll give you one quick example. If these trucks can drive themselves on the highway, right? You can sort of punch engage and it will, drive itself for 600 miles. But the time that the driver or the worker spends in that truck while it's driving itself can count as off duty, and they're not entitled to compensation, or at least minimum wage, while they're in the sleeper berth, right? So this is sleeper berth compensability and whether or not you can really be off duty. Why would you ever pull a driver out of that truck? So if you need them for local driving, right? Pick up and delivery, open the doors, bump the dock, navigate your way out to the highway, and then you hit engage, right? Why wouldn't you just keep that driver in that truck 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? And so I have a article that I wrote about that called, Will Robotic Trucks Be Sweatshops on Wheels?
Well, if I may, as a driver myself, I'm extremely skeptical that they're going to find willing volunteers to babysit an autonomous truck, right? Like, there was a great meme my friend Will shared a while back about, hey, this truck is going to do everything, but we need you to just stay in it in case anything goes wrong. And then when it goes wrong, we can blame you, right? Like, and I mean, to be honest, at times, for a certain type of personality, trucking can be boring enough as it is. Like, if you're sat on cruise control driving across Kansas or Nebraska, it's not exactly the most exciting job in the world. Now make it where you're interacting with the truck even less, right? So, like, who are they going to find to do this? Like, I wrote an article on this in my Substack. Like, you think there's a driver shortage now, wait until they make the trucks do even more of the work. Like, who the hell wants to just sit there while something else is doing it? And you're just babysitting it, and you're 18 hours away from home, not getting paid very much for the effort. Like, who the hell wants to do that?
Well, I think, that it's a real dystopian sort of vision, right? that machine that you're just kind of tending as it, traverses the country, right? Out of your control, right? Which is also sort of an interesting part of it. If you're sort of back there, sleeping, trying to eat, whatever you're doing, going on with your life for who knows how long, right? If they can go that, go on the highway from coast to coast, you just got to stop to fuel, right? And so it could be quite a hellscape in those trucks. But don't discount the ability of the industry to suck new people in, at least for 6 months, right? I think a lot of drivers probably 40 years ago couldn't have imagined the transition we've already seen to the labor market and the amount of de-skilling that could happen. So
you as you mentioned, when you were talking about researching your book, you've interviewed hundreds, if not thousands, of truckers. Yeah. You speak to us a great deal in the course of your work currently. Something I received some pushback when I first started talking about this and being, skeptical of the electronic logging device mandate and automatic transmissions and all of this imposition of this technology. And I said, this is going to make people like take early retirement or quit. And a lot of sort of eggheads who don't drive for a living were like, no, bro, this is just accentuating what they do. You're just a grumpy old guy and you're a Luddite and whatever. And I wear that with pride. I'm leaning into it now. Like, yes, as a Luddite, but nobody's ever done like an actual survey on that. But I'm going to ask you anecdotally, because I have seen this anecdotally. In fact, the imposition of this technology has made people quit or take early retirements, right? That's actually happened.
Yeah. We, and this has been the bane of my existence since I started studying this industry. We have terrible data about many critical aspects of the industry. we don't even know, I mean, this, we have these rough numbers of the number of people with CDLs. We don't know like who's working where for how long, when they're exiting, like, we don't have good data
or why
on any of that, what's that? Or
why they're exiting.
Or why? Yeah. I mean, some of this is understandable. When people leave an industry, they're not there anymore, so you don't know exactly where to find them, right? So you'd have to go and do, you get exit surveys, things like that. But we have a whole slew of public policy and some really expensive programs, and of course the consequences of accidents and billions of dollars associated with those every year, and the regulation of driving behavior, right? That is oftentimes based on very small scale samples, and not a lot of like really good data about, who's entering the market, how long they're staying, et cetera. So I think there's no question that, these kinds of regulations will, do push people, in and out of different segments or out of the industry entirely. And it is, it's the intersection of that regulation, right, with the compensation, right, the unpaid time, right. And one of the big factors that I think people discount all the time is length of haul, right. So length of haul has diminished tremendously, which means if you're unpaid at a dock, and you used to be unpaid at a dock twice a week, and now you're unpaid at a dock 4 times a week or 5 times a week, right? And now you've got the ELD, cutting into the hours you can drive, which of course it did, and it's still, I mean, we still have massive violations of hours of service regulations, right? I mean, nobody's logging their on-duty time properly in some segments. We all know this, right?
I did it. I worked for one company that had an ELD in their trucks, against my own good advice, but I needed the money. That experiment lasted for about a year, and every single day, the logging of the on-duty not driving stuff was not an accurate reflection of anything, because otherwise I wouldn't have got anything done.
Right. Right. And it's, it's because, I mean, you're not getting paid, right? So you're not going to log that time. And it's funny, I still see these big companies, they turn a blind eye to that, even though they've got all that data. And, they say, well, if you're not hand unloading the
well,
truck.
one of the reasons they turn a blind eye to it, and, I'm just spitballing here, is that you can present all of this data, and obviously there's gaps in it. Obviously, we don't have enough of the kind of data you just described. But, when you even do have hard data, the regulators just ignore you. So there was this situation last year before she stepped down. Robin Hutchison, the head of the FMCSA, was asked, I can't remember if it was by OIDA or the Landline magazine guys, somebody said to her, like, hey, here we have it. Truck accidents and aggressive driving behaviors are up since the implementation of the ELD mandate. It's achieved none of your aims. It's done nothing that was advertised. Are you going to pull this regulation back? And she's like, no. Like, you can have all the data in the world, but if the government doesn't want to listen, what's the point? And so, like, I have to wonder. So you have a position, you're part of this, this, what was the name of the group at, I saw you at Matt's.
Yeah. So I was appointed to the truck leasing task force that DOT has.
Right. So you have these groups. And one of the things that struck me about the leasing task force is there was 12 or 15 of you sat around in that horseshoe, only one truck driver in the whole group. Right. And, when you have situations like Ms. Hutchison just like outright saying we're not going to change this, and I remember when they tried to implement the ELD, they had another round of listening sessions after the law already came into effect. Like the cart was before the horse, and there seems to be a disconnect, right, between the regulatory sort of nerd management caste of people and then the folks they're regulating, where our input, even though we're shouting from the rooftops about the effects this is having on us, and we have the data to back it up in many cases.
Yeah.
Nobody's listening. How do we bridge that gap to get them to adjust the legislation as such?
Well, I think this gets to the fundamental issue, I think, raised by my book, but also by all these issues, which is that we have the largest chunk of drivers out there do not have a strong voice in these policies overall, right? And it's because drivers are largely unorganized, right? And the industry is very well organized, at least certain segments of it. Now you do have OIDA, which is often a very effective voice, but it's one having to battle against some very well funded folks from both the national ATA and then all of the state ATA, all the state trucking associations. And I really wouldn't underestimate the power of that kind of lobbying, especially in the House, where you can send in employers with both significant workforces to talk about, but also checkbooks.
Yeah. Speaking of the House and Congress, do you have any update on the Guaranteeing Overtime for Truckers Act?
I don't actually, and I have not been involved in any recent work on that, but I understand, there is bipartisan, there are co-sponsors now in the Senate for that bill. I think the main issue with it right now is concern that it would have inflationary pressure, right? From raising driver wages. Now, I mean, I think that in the long run, we're going to see, a more efficient industry. We're going to see better compensation, less turnover, et cetera. So I'm not hugely concerned about overtime. And I do, minimum wage and overtime. A lot of folks, I think, tend to think about the typical driver when they assess the importance of those. And you really need to think about the problem areas, right? So for instance, why is minimum wage so important, and why does it suck that it's at $7 an hour? Because if you are, one of these tens of thousands of drivers who get talked into a lease purchase agreement every year, and then you end up in a, class action lawsuit, right, where they're going after the companies for these back wages, it's that minimum wage and potentially the overtime that you would be due for the weeks when you literally didn't get a paycheck, right? And I know some of your listeners are probably really familiar with this, but typically what I see in these programs is that about every third week, someone's working for 5 or even 6 days that week when they, maybe take some home time and don't get paid at all, right? Because they're not making enough to pay all the truck expenses and get anything out of the, the revenue. So in those weeks, right, having that minimum wage or having that overtime, right, would make a big difference. But so someone just put up the consequences. Now, obviously, people are worried about inflation. You mentioned efficiency. A major concern of many truck drivers is detention, which is a problem that's been with us forever and never seems to go away. And one of the reasons for that is that there's no value assigned to drivers' time. Like whether it be minimum wage or overtime, there's just no value to it. And shippers and receivers can just abuse us and be as disorganized as they want because it doesn't cost them anything, right? There's a small percentage of shippers and receivers who do pay, specifically in niche markets, but like general freight, you're just getting your time abused constantly. And one of my arguments for supporting the Guaranteeing Overtime for Truckers Act is that provides a mechanism. If all of a sudden the driver's time is being appropriately paid per all other workers in the country, like we don't get some special carve out to be second-class citizens, well, then now shippers have to be like, okay, cool. Either we get these trucks moving, which makes them more efficient, which allows them to make more miles and then pay for that overtime,
or like it forces them to like actually have to pay for detention, because at some point this cost has to be moved down the line, right?
Yeah. No, and this is one of the only places in the world, right, where you can find people. And this, a lot of what interested me originally was how people understand this. But this is one of the few industries where you'll see people just sitting completely unpaid, right, for hours and hours, sometimes days, right? And the crazy thing is that you'll have all these drivers who, because they want to log it as off duty because they're not paid for it or whatever, will convince themselves oftentimes that they're, quote, not working, right? It's like, well, you're sitting in the truck, at a customer's dock, like waiting to get loaded up, like you're at work. I mean, I'm of the opinion that, basically you're on the job from the time you leave your house 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Like you're not doing that because you're out to go, fishing, or, you're on vacation or whatever. I understand that, sometimes drivers get to take time off here and there. And if they have a lot of control, they may even go see some sites or whatever, but you're working. I did the job. Like, if I wasn't driving, I was loading. If I wasn't loading, I was eating or sleeping, like that's 24 hours a day. Like that's the job. And why would you want to make it anything else? So you're totally right. The fact that is not compensated time means that the folks who are dispatching you, right, or the folks who are loading you, right, have that much less incentive. And of course, that's where the leasing arrangement, right, becomes that much more important. Is if the company's not paying the expenses of the truck, right, and they're not paying for your time, right, now they have that much less incentive to make sure that you're moving.
Right. I'm getting back to the lease operator question. You mentioned the washout rates. What do you think an adequate reform to that model is? Because there's still a lot of people, again, many critics of your book and your work, who say that this actually is a way for people to get into business. And, the government shouldn't stick their nose into private arrangements, which there's an argument for. What would a reform be, a sensible reform, to use political speak, to lease operator agreements and how they work so that there's less people getting washed out? What would that look like to you?
Yeah, well, I've got to put in this disclaimer that, since I'm on this task force, I'm not speaking for the task force or talking about anything that that task force may think or produce. But I've been studying this issue for 20 years, and to me, what you have when the employer has control over the debt of the worker is pretty clearly the potential for debt peonage, right? As they have leverage over you that affects your relationship with them as an employer, right? And going back, all the way from the days of sharecropping, right, and the end of slavery, U.S. law has been very clear that that's problematic, right? That is something that we need to be on guard for, when the person who is telling you what to do in work and then deciding what you make, right, also has large amounts of debt that they hold over you. So I think that's probably the key thing, is that intersection of being the employer and the creditor, right, is where so much of this problem starts. So I think that's one reform right there, which is if you're a carrier, no, you can't sell your driver a truck, right? That doesn't mean a driver can't go out and, lease their own truck and, go to a dealership, or there couldn't be some other, avenue. Now, there are other ways that this works, which are that, what Mike Belzer has been advocating for a while, which is a 2-check system, which basically says, we have to pay you for your work, and then we're going to pay you for your truck. Right. And the two are not going to be mixed up to the point where, you're going to have weeks when you're not getting paid at all for your work. You're going to get paid, for the time that you spend working for us. And then we're also going to compensate you for that truck. So I think there's some really basic things that you could do. Now I do think that the burden at this point, for those who've been in the, industry and around the industry, I think the burden is on these lease purchase programs to demonstrate that, there's more than a random person who makes it through and becomes an independent owner operator or something like that. Because the failure rates are so high. Right. And there is the question of, I think the bigger question of whether or not these programs, produce enough benefit that it's worth the cost.
Right. So we have the question of who's holding the debt. Another way that the industry gets people or bums into seats, as it were, is their sort of in-house CDL schools. Something I bang on a lot about is the fact that many of these schools are wards of the state. They rely heavily on state and federal and local subsidies, which I object to. And another thing they do is, lacking a state subsidy in whatever form that takes, they put the driver into some kind of debt arrangement to go to the CDL school. And that debt is likewise owned by the school and has interest rates which are similar to credit cards, if not worse. Could you speak to that a little bit? I believe you did talk about it in your book.
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you on this. I think the way that we do training is part of the problem. And the way I try to explain it to folks outside the industry and policymakers is that we're essentially, we've got our training system backwards, right? We've got a whole, hundreds of thousands in some years. I think you've had Steve Burks on your podcast. He's done some incredible research around recruitment and training and what those numbers could potentially look like. He and his co-authors, and it's a damning portrait, because when I say we have it backwards, what we're doing is we're essentially taking folks who are, completely new to the industry. We're putting them with some of the lowest paid employers in the toughest, areas of the industry, where they're going to be working for, weeks, months at a time, sometimes without returning home, oftentimes not making minimum wage, and then indebting them with this training contract. And it's not surprising, right, that a lot of folks who are going into that are already in some financial trouble, right? So they've lost another job. They've had, they've gone out on disability from another job, laid off, whatever it might be. They've accumulated some credit card debt. They may not have, great credit scores. Now you put this additional, $4,000, $6,000, $8,000, even $10,000 debt contract on them for that training, and you put them in a truck, right? Where they're going to have to live out of that truck, maybe with a trainer or, a co-driver for months at a time. And so again, this is where U.S. law has been pretty clear about debt peonage, that you're not allowed to hold somebody in your employment because they owe you money. That's because bad things happen when that's the case. And so I think, rather than that, so people say, well, what's the alternative? The alternative is like any other, training apprenticeship style program, where you start people local. If they're working for you, if they're moving freight, you pay them.
Imagine that.
Well, you pay them. So these training contracts, I think, are far, more, prevalent and problematic than policymakers certainly realize. Now,
yeah, I'm a big proponent of this solution, and I think we may have talked about this, but for the benefit of those watching, is graduated licensing. If you go trucking in New Zealand or Australia and other parts of the world, you do not get to pull a trailer without some kind of other license class firsthand, right? So like in New Zealand, they have what's called a class 4. So that's what we would call like a CDL-B here. In Australia, they have like rigid, and then you get to pull one trailer, and then you go get, and then after you've pulled one trailer for a year, then you can upgrade to like pulling, B trains or road trains. But everybody has to do 1 year of driving a like straight job, like a local delivery truck, a dump truck under a weight class. You're not pulling a 48-foot trailer for 1 year. Do
Yeah.
that first, and then you can go get thrown off the deep end doing the long haul stuff. And there's a sort of psychological component to this, right? So like when people get thrown off the deep end to do the OTR thing, as is the case through many CDL mills, is like you're far away from home. You have very little in the way of any assistance, training, coaching, anything for when things go wrong. And you have the added stress of being away from your family and being away from your social networks and your community. So like, if we're going to train people, we should probably take that part of it out of the equation, because that's going to be like weighing on their minds and distracting them from the task at hand, right? And so the model you have in New Zealand and Australia, like, they don't have the same turnover issues we do. I mean, Australia seems to be having a little bit of one, but I think that's got more to do with the age stratification of their truckers. They have a lot of guys retiring, but like, you know, and it also incentivizes companies. Like, if you can't just like get the government to pay for your CDL school, and you have to compete for people who have already done 1 year of effective training in a local capacity, that makes those drivers more valuable. It makes them more safe. It's going to decrease your insurance payout, because like if you're learning locally and you're not like immediately jumping into an 80,000 pound rig after going through Yahoo truck driving school for 3 weeks, like you're going to be a safer driver. But like, again, people who criticize your book tend to be boomer cons. Oh, we can't have the government, you know, interfering in things. That horse left the building decades ago. We're already up to our eyeballs in them interfering in things. I don't know how making a graduated licensing system is going to be any worse.
Well, I mean, I love that idea. And I think, you know, there's still companies that do that essentially. Like if you look at a UPS, a lot of their line haul drivers are coming out of package cars. You know, they're young guys who, you know, have driven locally, you know, in a 12, 15,000 pound vehicle. Right. And now they're going to go and get the class A. Two things I want to mention. One is that, you know, as dudes, we you know, we miss some things, and Desiree Wood from Real Women in Trucking has taught me a lot. Desiree actually has a new film out profiling her and a couple of the other women there at the organization called Driver. If you can find that and a screening of it, it's fantastic. But she really helped me understand what that, you know, throwing them into the deep end meant for women, particularly with this training contract. So you can imagine, you know, a woman who's coming into the industry already, you know, facing some additional challenges to what a man would face, having that, you know, coming in maybe with some bad financial circumstances or needs, getting put under that training contract. And then you're out in a truck for months with a guy who gets to decide whether or not you become a solo driver or whether or not you get that CDL, right? Or have to pay back that training contract without a job, right? And I mean, that's just a toxic situation, right?
Well, yeah. And I mean, it just denies human nature to stuff a male and a female into a tiny box and make them live together. And just all of the moral hazards that presents. That entire, whether or not it's two dudes or a man and a female, team driving as training must stop. That's not training. You're expecting people to be, never mind the guy learning, you're expecting the guy in the bunk to have to tolerate sleeping while someone fresh out of truck driving school is now driving the truck down the road. And you're supposed to sleep comfortably and with confidence. Like that whole thing should just be banned. I'm sorry. Sorry, libertarian and conservative bros. That program is bad for everybody. It's bad for women. It's bad for truckers. It's bad for the motoring public. And it should be terminated immediately.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. And that's part of that throwing people into the deep end. Like, are we surprised that there's so much turnover when that's how you have to get into the industry? That's before, I mean, so you got the debt peonage thing. You've got this potential for sexual assault. You've got just basic hygiene issues, right? I mean, everybody's a little different, whatever. Eating, the diet, right? Sleep, right? Hygiene, all that. Plus just personalities. You know, a lot of people get into driving because they're not people. You know, then they end up being a cleaner, you know?
Yeah, many such cases.
Yeah, and of course, then you layer in the independent contractor thing, and now you got somebody who's paying on that truck, trying to move that truck, also acting as a trainer, and they're not paying the bills, right? So they're behind, and then they got a trainee, and they're looking at them as a way to get more miles on that truck, and so that's just a bad situation. But I want to get back to that gradation, right? That graduated license. I think we should have the same thing for hours of service. To me, that's the solution there, or that's a potential solution. Is a lot of what we have was that re-regulation of driver behavior and time, because we had all these inexperienced drivers, right? If you haven't driven for more than 6 months, no, I don't want you working more than a 14-hour day. Hell no. But if you're somebody who, I think we should have two sets of rules. If you've got 500,000 safe miles under your belt, or we'll have some debate, right, or whether it's 200,000, 500,000, where you get that freedom. But if you have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of safe miles under your belt, I don't think I need a computer to tell you when you're tired. I don't think you need to. I trust you, right? If you got 1 million safe miles, like, I don't think you need any rules telling you when you can drive or how much you can drive. Like, you've proven yourself, right? Day after day of, consistently, conscientiously being safe. And I think that's where, and that'll put, of course, more pressure on that turnover, that high turnover system, right? Because if those drivers have, tight, reasonable regulations on when they can drive, they only have 6 months or a year in the industry, that's going to put more incentive on those companies to say, hey, you know what? Maybe it's worth retaining somebody who's safe and experienced, and I'm going to pay them a little bit more because they have more flexibility with their hours.
Right. So obviously we're being hosted by the Logistics Lounge guys. I want to shoot them an opportunity to ask you some questions. Pedro, Hunter, and we got Justin helping quarterback in the background here. Do any of you guys have questions for Steve?
No, I don't. I'm listening. That's what I'm doing. I'm listening, and man, interesting stuff. Interesting take on things, Steve. Sorry to sound crazy, but I heard your name before, but just kind of started looking into you yesterday when Gord sent all this to me. And of course he did that after I'd only had like 5 hours of sleep, so it was not able to retain a lot. But dude, I love your journey, for one, man. I want to say that, the way you've gone about this, getting experience, being a driver, obviously having your formal education, all that stuff. It's absolutely amazing the direction you took this to be able to get to the culmination of where you're at now in your opinion and stance and input on things.
Thanks.
Justin has a question.
Yeah, so you not only tried to talk the talk, you actually like walk the walk. Do you have any more advice to like your fellow intellectuals to like say they want to write about whether it's trucking, finance, you name it? You actually went out and got a job in this industry to really get on the ground experience. Do you see that as like a good way forward for people that are trying to advance their academic career?
I mean, I think, man, this is a tough one, because we have some great examples in trucking. Well, we've talked about 3 of my favorite authors in trucking. Karen Levy, Steve Burks, and Michael Belzer. Well, Steve Burks and Michael Belzer were both truck drivers before they became economists for a while in both of their cases. So I think the fact that 2 of those 3 are my favorite academics in the area is not an accident. I think there's too much of a I've got a hammer so everything looks like a nail in these studies, right? Where it's like, well, I only do this type of method, and so here's what I think the answer is using that data that it produces. And a lot of that I then collides with the fact that we don't have really good data sets. So on a lot of these that are big enough and granular enough to allow us to answer a lot of these questions. So you got to go out and you've got to You got to collect everything you can find that might help you answer it. But in trucking in particular, and in work in general, the people who are sort of your best source of data are often the most ignored. So it's like if what you're doing doesn't pass the smell test with workers, like it doesn't necessarily mean that you're completely wrong and there's nothing there, but you better figure out why it doesn't, right? I mean, like if you're coming up with studies using data and the people who are doing the work are like, I don't buy that, like you should at least spend some time trying to figure out why they disagree, right? And so I think absolutely doing the job is sort of number one. Because a lot of times what happens in the absence of that is what fills the gap is industry research. And we see this in policy all the time. I mean, you just look at the driver shortage narrative, right? I mean, this has been, bullshit forever, right? But if you ask any congressman or any, media person, almost every media person now, there's been some changes recently. They're all like, oh, there's a shortage of truck drivers. There's a shortage of truck drivers, right? And like, that's what'll fill the void when you're not actually talking to drivers or when you're not actually going out and seeing for yourself what's happening in the real world.
I think especially the driver shortage narrative, that's just been the work of lobbyists over the last few decades. I mean, we've talked to people in the media asking, how does this stuff happen? How do these articles get constructed? And most of the time, it's just you're a junior reporter, your producer comes to you and says, hey, I need you to do an article on trucking. They don't know anything about trucking, so you Google trucking experts, and what do you know? ATA is the first result that pops up, or they're a trusted contact within your organization, and you just go with whatever they're feeding you. You're none the wiser because you don't have the years of on-the-ground experience or seeing it firsthand of the problems that come with artificially flooding the labor pool for decades. We've been doing a very good job, I think, trying to push back on that, and there is some victories on that right now.
Oh, I agree. I think that's one of the, people are always like, are you optimistic about what's going to happen for drivers? And I say, there are a lot of signs of positive change, and people are like, well, what the hell are those? And that's my first example is if you look at the way that narrative has been challenged over the last, 5 years in particular, from voices like yourselves and even like Rachel Premack and Alana Samuels and some other reporters out there who've said like, what is this whole driver shortage stuff, about? Like, there's been a lot of counters to that, and the DOT's recent policy has acknowledged that. Secretary Buttigieg has sort of literally said, given voice to that, which you never would have heard before. Oh yeah, he talks about turnover being the primary problem overall. He says there's some quotes out there from him saying, we're issuing 400,000 CDLs a year. How is it possible that we're short, 66,000 drivers when we're producing 400,000 a year and losing 300,000? Those are their internal numbers now. And he buys that. So that's a huge positive change.
Big W. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love bringing up that topic to people outside the industry because depending on their background, they have different ways of knowing that is BS. Because like if you have a math background or a finance background, they're like, wait a minute, how can you have a shortage of anything for years and years on end and not see a massive spike in prices, wages, etc.? It's clearly when you look at the numbers, it's an oversupply because the wages have been down, year after year.
Yeah, and I plugged, Steve Burks again. Has done some recent work on this with Kristen Monaco and they actually one of the first pieces they put out was from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, basically saying like there's no evidence of a shortage of truck drivers.
Yeah.
But just gives you, I've never met Bob Costello, the chief economist there at ATA in person, but I really would like to talk to him. I gotta, if whatever they pay that guy, it's not enough money because what they've done with that shortage narrative and that one report that they, and I'm like, what is he? I want to know what nice fine bottle of bourbon or scotch he cracks open every year when he comes up with that number of how many drivers were short. And he must be like, you know what? We'll make it 80,000 this year. Like,
I mean, the president of the ATA, there's an article just came out the other day. The president of the ATA is getting like $5 million a year or $5.6 million a year, and they just signed him on for like a 5-year contract. So the point of the article was like, what are they? They're spending all this money on these guys. What do they have to show for it? And right now, it's nothing. They put on a couple of fancy dinners per year, and they get to glad hand with some politicians and some movers and shakers. But as far as like actual results, if I was a dues-paying member of this association, I'd want a refund.
Yeah. Well, they're big, funders, or they're the big companies who are putting in it. That's like your Primes and your U.S. Expresses, and those are the folks who really are driving the agenda there and paying the big dues. And they're concerned about, are they fighting on misclassification, right? Are they gonna preserve the lease, the lease contractor thing, and are they getting what they want out of hours of service, ELDs and on other regulations like that, and there they have a huge influence. When the ATA talks, a lot of these lawmakers listen.
Wish they'd listen to me.
Yeah, who do we need to like put money in their pockets of to like here? I mean, it can't be much, right? We'll take out to a nice dinner or something. We can crowdsource this, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think there's more and more effective voices like you guys. I mean, I think that the channels for getting voices out there have just expanded rapidly. I mean, you think about 20 years ago when a lot of the industry publications were what you'd pick up in a rest stop, right, or a truck stop, right? Like that was what a lot of drivers were picking up to like, what's that? And I mean, you didn't necessarily take it seriously or learn a lot from it, right? But like that was like where you'd get the headlines at least.
If we had $5 million, we could print off numerous copies of your book, Belzer's book, and Karen Levy's book, and distribute them for free at truck stops like Bibles, and then maybe we might get somewhere.
I wouldn't even go that far. This right here, this is the most powerful megaphone ever invented. I would just hire like a ton of teams on Fiverr and just flood the zone with like social media posts.
Yeah, I do think it's happening. I mean, so the I don't know if we put up a link to, or if you put up a link to that California study that I published last year, where we went out and talked to ag drivers. And that's the one where we went to the ports as well. And, I mean, drivers know people who've been in the industry for, more than even a year, right? I mean, they're getting information now that I don't think drivers would take you 5 years or 10 years to sort of get to where drivers can be now in 6 months or a year with all the information sources that are out there and the authentic driver voices that they're able to hear, right?
Yeah, this is true. It's not all for naught. Like from my own experience, a few years ago, several Twitter accounts ago, I was contacted by Representative Thomas Massey. Rest in peace to Mrs. Massey. Terrible tragedy that just took place. But he asked me to submit a letter to a Transportation and Infrastructure Committee just by like seeing what I was saying on Twitter. So like, I would recommend the people out there that are talking about this, just keep doing it. Sooner or later, the number of us versus the number of them, we exceed them. It's just a matter of putting to use the tools we have at our disposal.
Yeah, and I do think going back to that sort of big victory around the driver shortage narrative, even they're starting to concede that, or at least parts of that, right? Because when you hear them say, oh yeah, there's a shortage, but it's because of the lifestyle, right? Or the compensation. Before they used to just say, oh, it's because truck drivers are getting older and they're going to retire, which is like, well, that doesn't explain why all the young people who come in leave, right?
We saw during
the lifestyle thing, right? Which is like this lifestyle is this euphemism for working conditions.
Well, so you're
in on that one. It's not a lifestyle; it's working conditions.
So you're in the academy, and you know how all this works. You probably know what it takes to get a study funded. What would we have to do to get a mass exit interview program set up for the trucking business, where we find people who quit, pack it in, leave their truck wherever, walk away from the industry for whatever reason, and get them to, like, sit down and talk and or fill out some kind of survey, so that we can get some solid analysis to be able to take to these people and say, this is your churn problem and this is why.
That's a good question. We could continue that conversation, but I do think that those are things that we should be doing as part of like the policy process right now. Like these especially the training grant stuff, as well as safety, we should be funding much more robust surveys and sampling of the labor market. But a lot of this is intentional, right? We had for a while a contingent work survey that went along with the standard labor market surveys, that was meant to look at alternative work arrangements and stuff that was like early gig. And the Bush administration, 2005, like stopped funding it, right? And like, why did they stop funding it? Because they don't want that data out there. I mean, they don't want to see how many people are, being paid 1099s and are not, not making minimum wage or all. Like, they don't want to know any of that stuff. So I think we really should like be demanding that, like, that FMCSA, DOT should have an ongoing, and this is a major workforce, vital workforce of, millions of people with CDLs. Like, we should have an ongoing, survey of like, where are they coming from? How many hours are they working? What are their wages? Who's leaving? Why are they leaving? Right. With, a sophisticated ongoing study. Now, I'm trying to get that going actually in last mile delivery right now, because we're seeing this huge Amazon effect with like, we've got the U.S. Postal Service, UPS, and then Amazon. And I think, we're trying to set up a benchmark and then have an ongoing, survey of workers to find out what's happening in wages, work conditions, et cetera. So that stuff should just be that the government should be doing that if they're going to make policy, right?
They should have something upon which to base it, rather than the Grima worm tongues of the American Trucking Association. Steve, you've been very generous with your time, sir. Do you have any final parting thoughts about all of this before we let you go?
No, other than, thank you. This has been super fun. I'm sorry it took so long for me to come on the podcast. But, just like you and I love having conversations with drivers and others who are advocates and in the space. So my final thought is, reach out if you're interested in talking more with me. I love meeting new folks who are interested in the industry and helping drivers out.
Right. And people can go to your website, steveviscelli.com.
That's right. Yep.
And they can find a way to contact you there. As I understand it, you're not much for social media.
No, I mean, in the Luddite category, I'm probably beating you by a bunch, Gordon. My Luddite score is probably a lot higher.
All right. Well, thank you for wandering off the Luddite path for this live stream, sir.
Yeah.
Much obliged.
But before you go, Steve, if it's all right, man, we'd love to get connected with you, and sometime here down the road to have you back on as a logistics lounge guest. Man, we had tons and tons of comments we didn't even get to. I really think just a Q&A panel with you would be a phenomenal thing. Everyone loved everything you had to say. You obviously have a lot more to say on this. So if it's okay, if Gord connects us, we'd love to try to get you back on here in the future, man.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thanks for hosting and making
yes, sir,
it happen for us.
Of course. Thanks for being with us.
All right. Take care, guys.
All right. Have a good one, Steve.
Bye.
And we are going to carry on, I think, right, gentlemen?
Yeah, brother. We can
for a little while, little post show here. I understand there's some folks that wish to ask more questions and speak with us further.
Something I didn't want to completely derail the conversation, but something I wanted to bring up to him too is they need to study how quickly capacity comes into the market and how slow it leaves. Any talk of a shortage, etc. COVID pretty much proved that completely wrong. Like there can never be a shortage, especially in the U.S., because as soon as rates go up, capacity just comes rushing right into the market, and we saw that with COVID.
You can stay, Steve. You can stay if you want. I thought you were getting off, brother. Sorry, I thought you were leaving. You're more than welcome to stay.
No, I'm still here.
He heard me rambling on that. You wanted to chime in.
No, I agree. Yeah, it's we shouldn't allow them to get away with that. Like I said, the next the next thing we have to take down is this idea of a lifestyle. It's like the trucking lifestyle. It's like, yeah, those are working conditions, right? But yeah, I do need to run and take care of some kids stuff, so I'm gonna hop off. But yeah, thanks so much, guys, and I'd love to be back on at some point.
Of course,
thanks,
brother.
Steve.
All right, take care, Steve.
Thanks, sir.
Dude, that guy, man,
I heard he was one of the first people. So back when I was like first starting OTR trucking, I heard him on like NPR or something. And like most people, you listen to interviews with people, and anytime they're talking about whether you're an HVAC guy or construction worker or whatever, and anytime you hear somebody who's like an academic talking about your industry, 3 sentences in, you're like, this guy's full of shit. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about. I listened to him for this whole interview, and I didn't have my spidey sense go off one time. I was like, oh, this guy knows things. It was great.
Yeah, Steve's been one of the better ones. Again, I bump into people who want to disagree with them about stuff, and that's fine. Everyone's allowed to have an opinion on stuff. We all have them. Some of those assholes are covered in more shit than others, but I think criticisms of industry, criticisms of policy, like this is what the whole discourse is about. This is how we solve things. But I think some people just get their back up, like Steve's been on NPR a lot. And then, you get the whole bifurcation of our political discourse, conservatives versus liberals. You're on this team, you're on that team. And, that guy's on NPR all the time. Or, he's a socialist. He wants to have everybody be a member of the Teamsters. And it's like, well, he's never actually said that. And it's useful to have honest, legitimate critiques of something and take them on and talk about it and see what's good or useful about it or what we can do. And, and I think Steve's book brought a lot of interesting critiques to the trucking business and the economics behind it. I mean, you could have an argument all day. You got to have lease ops and you can't interfere, whatever. But like, if you actually read what he's saying, he actually makes some very he actually makes some like sort of conservative economic critiques. We don't want the government interfering in stuff, but because they stopped interfering in something the way the Carter administration did it with the Motor Carrier Act, all these other problems started cropping up, and then eventually the government's going to stick their nose in it. So let's talk about where all of this stuff interplays and what we can get them to do. And, there's a couple of points in Steve's book where he points out the sort of CDL mill thing and how they get all these different grants and subsidies and like just direct taxpayer funds. And if you're of a conservative mindset or a libertarian mindset, of which I am in many ways, the government shouldn't do stuff. They should not fund truck driving schools, especially the shitty ones that take people with 3 weeks of training and send them out OTR. That's not conservative economics. The government shouldn't be interfering in that. And it gets lost in all the rest of the discussion.
I think a lot of that is just people are unaware of how much of that funding comes in. When you have a company that's got over 100% turnover year after year after year, that labor's got to come from somewhere. And most people just assume that because people hear that there's a driver shortage out there, people naturally kind of flood into that. But there's a lot of nudging that goes along with that too. You get people that become trucking gurus. One of my favorite things to do nowadays is just go on YouTube and type in how to be a truck driver and find videos from like 2, 3, 4 years ago, see what those guys are posting about now. And most of it's they've gone from trucking to crypto to Airbnb. So it's like you very quickly understand that most of these guys are some hustler in one way or the other.
Right. So here's another thing, and this is where the conservatives are right. Trucking is a hard job. It's hard work. You have to put in a lot of time and effort into it. And like, fair play to Kevin from Let's Truck. Like, Kevin Rutherford wants you to be successful, and he's going to tell you things you don't want to hear. You need to drive slow. You need to have business acumen. You can't just like sign up willy-nilly without knowing what you're doing first. He's correct about all of that. And I think like the arguments that Steve makes in his book are complementary to the projects of somebody like Kevin, who wants people to be successful and wants them to understand what they're getting into. Steve's book, in a way, is showing that the certain bad actors in the trucking industry would rather you didn't do the Kevin Rutherford thing and you just sign up and go do it flying blind, right? So I think there's a lot of complementary stuff here.
Yeah. If I bring a driver on, say I'm a mega carrier, you need to pick your poison. I bring a driver on and they don't last at my company, I'm not eating that cost, by failing that driver. I just have another one to plug in right behind them. And until that supply gets cut off, they're not incentivized whatsoever to try and fix their own house before they make things better for their drivers.
Right. Yeah. And again, if it's easier, and I think even Steve addresses this in the book, he says they've basically, it's cheaper to have turnover than it is to solve it. Yeah. Right. To solve the turnover on your own and work with your customers and make life better for your drivers and pay the good ones better and have legitimate incentive programs that cost too much money when the government's just over here saying, well, we'll pay for your new guys. Right. And I think one of the things, Kevin, again, I'm a Kevin Rutherford stan here, is I spoke with Kevin. I have an article coming out here soon at American Compass, my second of my 3 essays for them guys. Finally got the thing submitted last week. But I interviewed Kevin for it, and we talked about how one of the early things Kevin did was consult with trucking companies to get them to alter their incentive programs, because there was stuff about fuel mileage that was beyond the driver's control. Like, if you're going to do a fuel incentive program, you have to do it in a certain way, and you have to structure your incentive things, your incentive programs in various ways for them to actually work. But like, you do the trucking companies, the mega carriers, have no incentive to use the incentive programs when the other incentive for them is just to get free government money, right? Yeah. So anyways, you fellas mentioned someone wanted to come on and chat or ask me a question.
Oh, Fred Stair. He was you and him were talking earlier on LinkedIn through comments, and Fred is a driver. Actually met Fred this weekend at the event. Really good guy, and he just said, hey man, if you get a chance, let me know, I'll hop on. So let me see if he's available.
Sure, I'll talk to anybody.
Yeah, Fred's a good dude, man. You'll have a good talk with him. But I'm with you guys with this whole driver shortage thing. It's been there since I came in the industry. It took me a while to fully understand it, because like you pointed out, Justin, and also you, Gord, the media just regurgitates shit that they're told. You know what I mean? Driver shortage. And it's a fucking retention problem. That's what it is. It is a driver retention problem, and until that gets fixed and drivers are being paid what they need to be paid, getting all the things that they need to make them happy, whether it be home time or a nice terminal or whatever it is. And these companies start learning that it takes less money to keep someone than it does to hire someone. And I don't know how they're doing their math, but when you recruit someone, you've got to put out ads, you've got to pay the recruiter to take those calls, you got the drug testing, you've got all the other doctor's appointments you got to do. Then if they're a newer driver or they don't have all the experience you got to put them with a trainer. So you're paying a trainer money. You're all of these fucking stupid things that you got to do to bring them on, pay their ticket,
right? Well,
and all that.
Speaking of paying, a lot of companies now seem to have like a massive HR and health and safety department, and you've just got to pay all these people to monitor and basically act as babysitters. Like, that's a significant business cost, man. And if you've got people that are good and don't need that, then you shouldn't have to have it. To my mind, another thing that intersects with all of this is insurance. And I had a chat with this fella down in Texas who's been in the trucking insurance business for like over 30 years. And I asked him point blank, I said, so if you're me or an owner operator with a similar level of experience, 25 plus years, no collisions, you should be getting a really steep discount. And he's like, well, most of the major insurers can't offer it because the payouts for all of the retards are so high, the nuclear verdicts, the constant, the sort of constant number of accidents and stuff that go on, that they literally can't offer people who are good discounts. So that's a distortion of like incentive, right? Like, if you're a really good driver and you want to do well and you don't want to have any problems, you would think the insurance industry could award you for that, and they're not doing it, right? They can't. And they can't because of the turnover problem and the churn problem, right? They just keep bringing in new people. New people tend to get in more accidents. More accidents keep happening. The insurers can't give the good people discounts, and it just kind of keeps cycling along like this. Like, and for how long? Like, how long can this keep going in the way that it is and still be cost effective? Like, I don't know. I'm just spitballing, but it just seems ridiculous to me.
No, that's 100% true, and not to defend insurance companies, but like it has been tough because if you're trying to cut, like, most of these mega carriers, they can't get insurance, so they self-insure. Like, they literally are too risky for an insurance company to go, yeah, sure, pay me a premium and I'll cover it. It's like, no, they're that stupid.
Yeah, I have to wonder if the self-insurance thing, that's another tough one. Do you want the government to ban that, or is that like a bridge too far? Is that like too much interference? I mean, I don't know, but it seems like
I don't see them banning it because the Postal Service is self-insured.
So here's a question for you, because you were in the Postal Service for a long time. Like, what's their sort of like safety record and accident statistics look like?
Just purely anecdotally, I would say it's better for postal drivers than it is for postal contractors. Like, we had all those articles that came out over the last few years about all these horrific accidents from these postal contractors that had been used for years, and it was just kind of swept under the rug. And most of that is because internally they call that a network specialist, the person who's in. So you have like a supervisor who's in charge of postal drivers, and then you have a network specialist who's in charge of the contractors. And if you, as a network specialist, are running all these contractors and they're a bunch of screw ups, there is no penalty on your side. Your pay, your job, everything isn't really at risk if those guys are all a bunch of screw ups. You just find another driver to cover for them internally. And again, until those incentives are like really twisted into that person, they're not going to get fixed.
Interesting. Yeah, and a lot of, there's a lot of talk about like contractors, and obviously with the lease operator thing. And then, the FreightWaves guys did an article, I don't know if it was recent, maybe it was last year, about, the sort of number of mom and pops relative to the number of megas, right? Like, there's still a certain amount of capacity in the market that's still small companies. But those smaller companies, sometimes it's are sort of bad actors with the indentured servants, and the people that employ guys at the Port of LA that really don't pay them very well, and the sort of people that abuse folks, as our friend Richie has seen in New Jersey and all that. But we have Fred. Who's Fred?
What's up, Fred?
Hey, how you doing, guys? Good to see you.
Good.
Again,
Nice to finally put a face to the voice.
Nice to meet you, Freddie.
My profile is my face, Hey, Gord, how you doing? I've seen you on posts, and I saw you guys all hooked up at Matt's. I didn't make it up there this year, but hope we can actually meet in person one day and sit down and have a beer, But I don't know Steve's work, so listening to what you're putting out, I will get his book because I do read a lot, so I will get his book, and I'll either listen to it on audio if it's available, or I'll actually read it because. Like you said, a lot of things have been kind of put out there in the ether that may or may not be true. So, you know, I'm of the mindset that I would look at it with the what you were saying about you know, signing a contract with a carrier to put you through school and staying there. I would look at that as how the military does things. They'll give you schooling if you sign up for a certain amount of years. I think that's not bad to hedge their bets. Now, I would say, and also what you brought up with the government funding this, so that's.
Red.
You know, I mean, I believe
he's in
you're going
Midland.
to have a true. Am I intermittent?
Yeah, a little bit. You were chopping up.
And I'm in West Texas.
Well, while he tries to figure that out, I did verify the Big Rig by Steve Viscelli is not on Audible. It's available on paperback and Kindle and hardcover.
Right. Yeah. I have it on my Kindle and
that.
soft cover. Can you repeat your question, Freddie?
I'll download it tonight. No, what I was saying was, I believe that if a carrier is going to have a true training program, make the driver sign a contract, reimbursement, I think they should be government funded.
I mean, they have training programs now where drivers have to sign on for a minimum.
Hear me?
I mean, they had that back when I started. It was 18 months at Schneider, and I want to say it was $4,000 or $8,000 or something now. But now it's it could be over $10,000 for some of these CDL programs that you have to stay in for a minimum amount for, and people still walk out of those.
I'm not really concerned. Yeah. I tell him I have a program like that. A program by the federal government.
No, he's chopping up.
Yeah, your signal service is terrible, sir.
I'm in West Texas, if you can hear me.
Fred's using a Neil's phone.
I'm
Yes,
in West Texas driving.
Shout out to all the listeners.
Maybe if you kill your camera, if it's just
I'd rather
audio,
have
that come clear.
Yeah.
Don't.
And he's
Is that
gone.
better?
Maybe. What was?
Yeah.
Can you repeat what you were saying, sir?
All right. I said I'd rather have a system, government backed, and a system where you have to contract X amount of time for X, for your training. This way, the carrier is at risk, and so I don't want to see a double dipping.
Right. Well, see what happens. Everybody, I acknowledge everybody has some skin in the game, or at least has to, right? So the carrier has some skin in the game, and they should want to keep a driver around for as long as possible, because we all know a more experienced driver is a safer driver and a more productive driver, right? And the driver's got to have some skin in the game. It can't just be a freebie. It can't be a freebie from the government. It can't be a freebie from the companies. And they have to, they should have to want to have some skin in the game. Now, a lot of these schools, the whole reason we're having this discussion is because older methods of training and getting into the industry are drying up, right? Like, I grew up in an old school. My dad was a trucker, both my uncles, my grandpa. I worked at a trucking company at night after school, washed trucks, greased trailers, helped the mechanics, ran around with the local guys, tarping loads, chaining shit. Like I did all that stuff informally, right? And then eventually got my license. But like, there's not very many companies do that. And because nobody wants to pay to keep good people around anymore because the incentives are all wrong, those informal training methods, such that they still exist, can't keep up with the demand caused by the churn. Did we lose Freddie?
Yeah, we lost him.
Oh, well, Way of the
I'm sorry,
road.
Pete, Fred.
Way she goes sometimes. Fred, if you're still listening, man, anytime. Another book, seeing as how we're doing book recommendations. So one of the things what happens when, like, if you're someone like me or anybody else, you know, you're always thinking about a bunch of different stuff that's related, and then sometimes that doesn't necessarily come out very clearly in my own communication, which, you know, is a constant a work in progress. Is that a lot of this stuff overlaps, right? The imposition of technology. Why are we doing this? Because the drivers suck or people suck. Why do they suck? They're not getting trained properly. Like, all of this stuff sort of overlaps. And another book I want to recommend to people for understanding the situation we're in 2024 with all of this, and especially with the technology stuff, is a book by a guy named Matthew B. Crawford called Why We Drive, Towards a Philosophy of the Open Road. And in the book, Crawford talks about the imposition of this technology on cars, the markets for cars, why you can't get manual transmissions anymore, the sort of the snake eating its tail of, like, technology versus training, human operation versus, you know, artificial intelligence and sensors. And, you know, what does this all mean for the sort of human experience of navigating reality? And I think a lot of what Crawford talks about in that book has overlap with the training discussions we're having here. Corey can't believe that I'm real.
Corey is very real.
Shout out to Corey, DOT Roadside on Twitter. Good guy. I got to get him on my show here. I need to have 32-hour days. And Lombard asked where I got my hat. Another shout out to Read When Safe. Great Twitter account, makes lots of, like, little video memes. Himself a truck driver in Chicagoland. I think he sort of, like, is a sole proprietor, shunts Amazon trailers around Chicago. Good guy, interesting videos. I interviewed him several months ago, and again, when God gives me 32-hour days and some more time, we'll get the interview with Read When Safe out, and he very generously gifted me this hat. I think our friend Indie Trucker has one. So, talk to Read When Safe and get yourself an autonomous trucker's hat.
Oh, looks like Fred's back from the dead.
Freddie's back.
Yeah, I'm in West Texas, guys, so my service is sketchy. I'm going to try to get to an area where I'm good, but I should be good for a minute here. But,
all right, shoot.
Yeah, well, I heard that. But, you know, another thing you guys were discussing, I didn't see the whole show, but I caught a pretty good size of it. So you guys were discussing the women coming into the business and being put with men in trucks, and the potential lawsuits and stuff like that. And I agree there is a lot of risk there, but you know, I would I know it's not happening now, but I believe if you're gonna be a carrier that does that and have male trainers training female trainers, I think the male trainers have to be vetted a lot more stringently than just a 6-month driver that we just know 6 months and let's throw these two people together and see if they work out.
Sure,
3
there's a
months
lot.
in some cases.
There's a lot of vetting that needs to take place, and yeah. My solution isn't really based on gender. I mean, obviously, this is a problem, especially for women truckers, and no disrespect to them. You know, like there's been a lot.
Is it really a problem, Gord? Because
it is though. There's been significant lawsuits against companies from various sexual misconduct that's taken place downstream of this ridiculous idea that you stick two members of the opposite sex in a box and expect human nature to just stop. My solution to this is team trucking as a training program should be made illegal. Full stop. You cannot be in a team and have your trainer sleeping in the bunk and then you driving the truck. It's not training. That's not training at all. Never mind doing it with a male and a female who don't know each other. So my solution to this is training should be working local, and everybody goes home at night until they have enough months of experience working local, and then they go out on the road, and then you eliminate the requirement for these stupid team training operations to begin with, which I believe are fake and is not real training.
I'm glad you brought that up. Can one of you guys throw up this Facebook image? So there is a mega carrier out there that has 2 trainees and 1 trainer in the trucks. And so they have bunks set up where at the top of the cab, they just throw an extra bunk in there. And, they're running team loads. And, those loads typically pay more because they got to get to, their destinations faster. But I just think it's ridiculous that you have 3 bunks in 1 truck now because they're trying to cram as many guys in the truck as they can to maximize what they can off of these loads. It is ridiculous.
Yeah, it's a human meat grinder because, again, this is spreadsheet brain. This is when you get bean counters and accountants trying to run businesses and maximizing the decimal places while they completely ignore the human element. This business involves people, and people have certain requirements, and people have needs, and you can't just again, no offense to accountants, but the spreadsheet brain component to this is an extremely critical part of the story.
I love that spreadsheet brain. I was talking to somebody yesterday. I was talking to a friend of mine on the phone yesterday, and I mentioned the phrase bean counter, and he'd never heard of that before. That really surprised me.
Yeah, well, lots of youngins out there. Shout out to my friend Ashley from the Doomer Optimism podcast for giving me spreadsheet brain. But yeah, to answer Freddie's question, this is just an illegitimate form of training, regardless of gender.
No, I can see that. Another thing on these lease purchases, I actually know a lot of guys that actually successfully went through some of these. They're in a certain sector, but I think they are all doable. Again, I think it's up to the carrier to guide these people who want to be in business so they can succeed and actually finish purchasing the truck. I don't think they should be outlawed. I think everyone has a right to fail, as everyone has a right to succeed. And as far as, like I said to you on our post, I think our government solution should be government out. And, education, unfortunately, is something that I don't think we're ever going to solve because, the old adage, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. I heard a new one, actually with Kevin's show. You can lead a person to knowledge, but you can't make them think, right? So
exactly. No, you're right. And Kevin's right about a lot of things. And I don't know if you got this part, but one of the things I said to Steve was that, following your point, people should be allowed to fail. But what happens is that these industries come to defend on the processes which cause people to fail. So a bunch of people fail and then these other guys win is not really a recipe for success for a number of people. But you're right about the education part. This is why I think what Steve has written and what people like Kevin do is complementary. Kevin is constantly harping on people. You need to have business acumen. You need to do your homework. You need to look into this more. You can't just jump into being a lease operator. And I think Steve is saying the same thing. And what happens is these bigger companies that have traditionally taken advantage of people, maybe those big companies need to team up with Kevin Rutherford and he needs to franchise his operation so that everybody gets taught properly before they sign on the dotted line. Right.
But I believe, that is I think a recipe for success. But, again, to your alternative point is, why should they do the hard work when the government's funding everything so they have nothing to lose?
Right. No, exactly.
I agree. To get the government out of the way.
I agree with you 100%. I want the government out of the trucks. I want the subsidizing CDL mills gone. I want the bringing people here from the third world gone. That's the government's purview, and they're doing it on purpose. Sorry, guys. The American trucking industry is not an ATM for gangsters in Eastern Europe to extract value from, and gangsters from the Punjab in India to bring indentured servants here to drive our trucks and then cycle them in and out. That's the government allows that. Gone. ELDs. It is not the government's job to micromanage my life. Gone. I'm with you, man. The government's up to our eyeballs in this, and they shouldn't be.
Yeah. But Justin, I gotta know, why has it taken so long for the industry to push back on the driver shortage narrative? Like, we have these technical, quote unquote, uh, OOIDA and all these other nefarious operations, But why is it taking so long for us to get some traction here when we're supposed to have these organizations looking out for drivers, right?
It depends on what you mean by the industry, because if I'm a trucking company, a narrative out there that there is a shortage is to my benefit, especially if
Sure.
I'm being subsidized for that
I'm
shortage.
talking about the publications, though. Like the
Yeah.
publications that that are supposed
So
to be biased or leaning towards driver interest.
yeah. So the publications that put out that there is a shortage, a lot of it is just clicks. If I put out an
Okay.
article that says there's an 80,000 driver shortage, those articles get more clicks than a super nerdy, really into the details
Right.
article about why there really isn't a shortage. That's
Yeah.
not going to get as many clicks as an article that says like, "Holy crap, we're short. If you want to apply, go to this link in the article somewhere."
Yeah. I get you. That makes sense.
But I think enough of them are taking enough of a reputational damage by putting out those shortage articles that they're starting to kind of come around. It's a slow process, but it's picking up steam, I think.
Well, I believe because of X, a lot of that is coming to light too. Just
Yeah.
enough people having a voice here, calling certain things out.
I knew we were onto something when the head of digital at that news station in Jacksonville reached out to me, because she was like, "Look, when we put a post up on Twitter, we'll typically get like this many hits on it, and then this one that so they did an article about a trucking company that couldn't hire drivers even though they were paying $20,000 a week." And
Yeah.
of course, the drivers on Twitter like went in there and just completely blew up their mentions. And she's like, our metrics on that post are like through the roof. So I
Yeah.
think one, they were like, okay, we kind of screwed up. Please tell us what we did. But they were also like, hey, this was a really big hit. How can we keep this going? And what it was is it was a industrial waste company, or a hazmat tanker company that was hiring owner operators, and $20,000 was what they were paying to the teams. So you as a driver, for one, you got take that 20,000, split it in half, and then divvy it out amongst your operating costs and stuff. So at the end of it, they're probably making only a little bit more than your typical truck driver out there. But having that really flashy $20,000 a week as a truck driver was
Yeah.
like,
I remember seeing those billboards down in Texas here. Yeah.
yeah. And most people who aren't in the industry, they don't know the difference between it's gross revenue, not net revenue, and it's not including your insurance and your fuel and your permits and all that. So they see 20,000 and they're like, oh, that sounds great.
Well, I mean, how can you expect anyone outside the industry when 90% of the owner operators here don't know that either, right? So,
Yeah.
it really is truly a shame. And the guys that do turn into guys like Kevin will learn, or at least have the opportunity to learn. Again, I have quite a few friends in this industry that actually pay for his software and never use it. So I don't have them. I don't understand that mindset, but that's what they do, right? So.
Well, speaking of like an opportunity to learn, we got that hurricane possibly heading towards Texas right now, and there's all this hope amongst like the people that follow the freight data and stuff. They're really expecting or hoping for it. It's just really horrible to say, but they're expecting like freight rates to spike because of this. And I was talking to some finance guys last week, and they were asking me like, why does this happen? And I said, well, when a hurricane comes through and it devastates an area, you get these FEMA loads that go down there, and FEMA loads pay like crazy. And so they were asking me all these questions about FEMA loads, and I knew a little bit. Like I've never done a FEMA load, but I've talked to drivers who have, and it's if you don't know what you're doing, it's kind of a recipe for disaster, because these guys will see that it's paying $12 a mile and they'll run down there and get it, but they don't realize, one, there's not going to be any power when you get there. There's going to be no freight coming back. So you're going to be sitting for a couple of days probably. So the reason why these loads pay as high as they do is because of all those extra factors. Have any of you guys in here done a FEMA load before?
Well, I've pulled oversized down when that BP oil spill happened, and I think it was 05, I guess it was. I actually had a lot of loads coming out of I was up in New York at the time. So I mean, but yeah, you're right. I mean, I got down here to the Gulf, and we sat for a few days, um, to get unloaded, just because it was chaotic, right? So and the same thing is with a lot of these FEMA loads, these regular van loads, because they just don't have places just to unload sometimes. So yeah, it is, and no one of course gives anyone any information.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. That's what I worry about is you'll get somebody who's only been driving for 6 months to a year or two. They see that FEMA load on the board and they're like, oh, I'll take it, and then they get down there and they're completely out of their depth.
right. And again, you have because of the way this is set up, you have brokers that'll throw things out for $4 or $5 a mile. Perhaps they're making 10 or 12. And I'm not here for broker transparency. I'm all for a free market. And if you don't do your due diligence to understand the sector or the market that you're in, then it's on you. So I have no problem with a broker making 50, 60, 70% if I have the rate that I'm comfortable with. It's up to me to be a better negotiator, I feel, on that. Now I'll get pushed back and everything, and that's fine. I'm a big boy. I can have my own opinion still in this country.
Do you think the problem with a lot of these like newer owner operators is that as a truck driver, just a company truck driver, you're already wearing like 5 different hats, and when you're going from that to now you're an owner operator, you might as well be wearing 50 different hats because now you got to be a dispatcher or a broker, salesman, mechanic. Either you have to be all these things, or you pay somebody else to be that on your behalf.
Right. Well, see, I'm in a unique position. I've never been a company driver ever. I've never driven for anyone. I mean, family members, but that was, because it was what it was, right? But I mean, and that was only like on trips here and there. So I was in the industry, growing up in the industry. Then I went to service for 5 years, came out, bought a truck, and here I am. So I've never ever experienced working for a mega or living in a truck. I don't do that. I've never done that. I've always I'm a person that you give me the deal and tell me the rules, and I'll make the deal work for me. Not for anyone else, but for me. And that's how I've always succeeded in this business. So I've changed hats quite a few times. I've been in a lot of different sectors in this industry, and I've always done well. Yeah, I was in the drayage industry. I've done well. I was in the van industry. I've done well. I was in the reefer industry, flatbed, oversized industry. Now I'm in the tanker industry. So I've done quite a few things in this business, and again, in and out of these sectors over the years. But again, so for someone to say I can't succeed in this business or even in these times, I don't really kind of comprehend that, in a sense that I don't care what I got to do. I will succeed in any downturn. It's going to be difficult. I'll have to tighten my belt in certain areas, but I will succeed. I will persevere through this.
Freddie, have you ever heard of a concept called the Pareto distribution?
No, what's that?
The Pareto distribution is this. It's a sort of theory that's proven across many areas. It was first brought forth by an Italian philosopher named Vilfredo Pareto. And as it applies to sort of human and social endeavors in business, it sort of goes like this. It's like a calculation. Like, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's like in any given organization, in any given field of endeavor, between 50 and 80% of the output will be completed by 20% of the people putting in the inputs, right?
Okay. I have heard this, but didn't know the name of it. Good.
Yeah, basically like, you are part of the productive 20%, right? And that's great. And I'm very happy for your success, and I'm sure Steve would be too. And, the success of people like Kevin Rutherford. But you got to remember, you're in a minority. And a lot of people getting swept into trucking who end up at the mega carriers, who end up wherever, are not. They are in the 80% more often than not. And part of the reason for that, again, is government interference. The government looks around at unemployment rolls, the long-term unemployed, people on social assistance, and says, where can we put these people what's the easiest thing to get them off of our rolls? Well, let's just push them into trucking. Well, you can't take people with the incorrect mentality and push them into a business where you got to work your butt off. You got to know what you're doing. You got to understand the rules of the game like you understand them, and then expect them to succeed if they don't have the right mindset. You can't force the 80% of people to be the 20% productive people.
Right.
And that's what the government's constantly doing, right?
Yeah. No, I 100% I agree with that. But I would also say that nothing was ever handed to me. I've said this publicly, even on Kevin's show. My education came at a great financial cost to me, because I knew better and I made the decisions in it, and I screwed up, right? So, my whole analogy, I use it all the time. When my father said that the oven was hot, the stove was hot, I grabbed on with 2 hands to make sure, right? So I got burnt pretty bad. And I was always able to persevere through that, through just sheer determination and will. I've had in my life where I was hiding my leased car because I couldn't pay the payments. And then I've also had in my life where I was making stupid money, like being like a congressman, just doing some pretty wild, outlandish things, because money is just kind of a tool to me. I like it. It makes my life easier. It makes me able to do certain things I want to do, but it's not really the ultimate essential driver in my life. It's never really been a driver in my life. I thought nothing of going to Atlantic City and dropping $5,000 overnight, because I knew I could make it up next week. And that's just the drive and the mindset I've always had. And even in this business right now, I'm like, I have no problem. If everything was swept away tomorrow, I would buy another truck somehow, get another truck, and I'd go back to work and rebuild. So, and this is just because of my confident level in my own ability. And I'm not one to, I don't look down on anybody. I don't, and I'll help anyone next to me, ahead of me, or behind me, to get to this, to get to a level that they consider successful. And that's why I gravitated towards Kevin Rutherford, because, our stories kind of are trajectory on the same pattern. We started in a trucking family. We've had some failures along the way, but always picked ourselves up and moved forward. And so, him and I, we get along really well because we've been through a lot of the same fires over the years.
I think that's what sets you guys apart from a lot of the what I would consider trucking gurus, especially like right at COVID, is that most of these guys, they were giving out all this advice and their opinions because literally everybody with a pulse was making money at the time. But as soon as the market downturned, they just cut and run. Like they're not talking about this stuff at all. Whereas you guys, you've been through a couple of cycles and you know what it's like to go through a down market. So yeah, trying to get people to listen to you guys versus these guys who, as soon as things turn bad, they just cut and run. That's a big project.
I purchased the truck I'm driving right now in April of 2008, and just finished a sale of another business, so I was cash fluent, but I decided to go out, buy a couple of trailers, and get my own authority. And then what happened in 2008, right? Everything, the bottom just fell out. And then right midst of that, my cat spun a bearing, and I had to rebuild the engine. Okay, so talk about a perfect storm. But here I am, almost 15 years later, 14 years later, and I'm fine. So I mean, these are the things that I hear people, and I feel bad for them. They've been in the business for a half a dozen years, and they're one breakdown away from failure. And I feel bad for them, but they still don't want to listen. It's become I think it's become a crutch in our society to blame everybody but ourselves. And I've always been a person to take hard case responsibility on myself. And
extreme ownership.
What did I do to get myself here. And not when I was 17 and I was in the Navy and I thought everyone was against me, but when I got older, I realized it was my cocky ass New York attitude that got me in those troubles, right? So, I'm big enough to step up and say, hey, I screwed up here, I screwed up there, but let me help you learn from my mistakes, and that's where I fall on this.
If I may interject, I just want to kind of give my little synopsis on this. So I've said this several times on the show across a multitude of topics, and I say it about a lot of things, not logistics, but as the great communicator said, there is nothing that the government can do that the private industry cannot do better. Now, am I under the fallacy that this could all run without some type of government oversight or them being involved? No, I don't. However, with everything that we're talking about here, the government has made this either a revenue stream for themselves, which is all these new people that come into the industry, they pay the little few $100 fee. That's why they have no fucking reason to stop all the fraudulent stuff, the double brokers. When it comes to all of this stuff with the CDL mills, the autonomous trucks, the EVs, that is the government now making it profitable for other people to take advantage of a situation. And it gives people an incentive to abuse, and mislead and put out all this information, bad drivers, bad equipment, bad technology, all these things that we're seeing right now. And so really we do need to pull them out of it somehow. We've got to start, and even furthermore, we've got to start getting people who know this fucking industry, like Fred and Justin and Gord and me and Kevin. Well, I can't put myself on Kevin's level, but people like that need to be the ones in charge, in positions of power and decision-making positions in these government agencies that are a part of our industry. And also where the place where they're dishing out this money, the training thing. I agree with you guys. Man, it's ridiculous. 3 weeks is not enough. It is not, especially if you've never been around trucks or driven anything like that. And these places, they have nothing but incentive to push people out as fast as they can. Who gives a shit how well trained they are? As long as I can get you through the program, you pass your CDL test, and the government gives me the $5,000 subsidy that they're kicking me. And I'll tell you, where I live, I've seen probably in the last 5 or 6 years, 5 or 6 trucking companies, truck schools open and close. They'll be open for a few months and then they close down, and another one will pop up. And a few of them had been in the exact same building, which leads me to think that they were probably the same people. So my point is, I really feel that we do need to start getting the government get out of it for the most part. We all know that they're going to do nothing but continue to ruin this industry. If someone can name one fucking thing that the United States government has ever done that has worked properly, I mean, then please let me know, because I don't know one. I mean, every time they put even so much as a pinky in something, it's fucking ruined, man. It's just ruined with bureaucracy and red tape, and then they put idiots in place to run things, just like Uncle Pete. Just like Uncle Pete, how that guy, got his job, never being in transportation before, and now you're in charge of making all these decisions and doing all these things, just completely baffles me. But all right, I got to end this. I have so much stuff to catch up on, Gord. I'm sorry, dude. I would stay on all fucking day, Gord. Like I love talking with you, man. I love listening to you talk, man. We met at Matt's. I think I followed you for like 3 hours, bro, back and forth, just listening to you talk about shit.
I appreciate that, and it still amazes me anybody listens to anything I have to say. But thank you very much for giving up your platform today, and I really appreciate all the listeners, anybody that came out to check this out, whether it's Steve, listen to Freddie, Justin, Hunter. Thank you all very much for your time, which is the one commodity we cannot create more of, and is the most valuable one we have. And every minute that you spend with us is a gift. Thank you so much.
100%,
Hey,
man. And
Gord, come join us on some of these spaces at night and stuff, buddy. You can.
Well, I got 2 kids and a couple of jobs. It's not as easy as it sounds, but yes, I'll try
Oh,
and
come
make it to
on.
one.
He's not driving all day like you guys are. Gord, we
Yeah,
need to
I
do
know,
this
I
again
know.
sometime
Yes,
and go
Absolutely.
do a deep dive into the mechanics of like why guys like us aren't in those positions. It'll be you and me with like 50 Mencius Moldbug blogs and just breaking it all down for his audience because we're gonna break some minds with this.
Hey, Gord, I told you, man. Please use us, brother. I mean, anytime you want to get something out live, you know what I mean. Yeah, man. Save your $50 or $100 and just come on over here to us and we'll let you use our platform, man.
Yeah, speaking about parasitizing on somebody else paying for my shit. All right. Hey, listen, thanks again. Thanks, everybody. Happy Canada Day. It's
pleasure,
July
Gord.
1st.
Oh man.
Let us not forget, in Justin Trudeau's Canada, we have political prisoners, and the place is going to shit under his leadership, and Canada needs to be liberated. All you Americans sitting around with nothing better to do, make Manifest Destiny great again. And with that, I'll bid you all adieu.
Fuck yeah. Later, Gord. Thanks, man.
You got to call him Castro's son.
All right, take care, guys.
All right, Justin,
All
you have any exiting comments, Justin?
No, this has been fantastic. Pedro and Hunter had to leave. Thank you guys so much. This has been super generous of you guys. We kind of hacked this together last minute. Thank you again so much for giving us your platform for this.
Nah, brother, I
Justin, always a
appreciate
pleasure
you.
talking to you too, brother. Thanks.
Yeah, it was good meeting you, Fred. It was.
Oh, yeah.
I'm so sorry we didn't get more time, man. Like I was being
good.
pulled all over at that thing. So I can't wait to see you
time
again.
hanging out with Evan at Truck Parking Club. What a sharp young man he is. I mean, just really good time with him. So.
Well, good, brother. I'm glad you came out. And Justin, like I told Gord, dude, any time, man. And we were honored for you to ask, brother. So yeah, I would love to have Gord on again, man. The dude is, I don't know, when he talks, people listen, whether they're listening out of like or dislike, hey, we don't know, but still, he's a great person to have on. You gentlemen have a wonderful rest of your day. Fred, be safe out there on the road. And thanks everyone for tuning in for the special edition of the Lounge. We will be live this week at our normally scheduled times, except for Thursday, because it is the 4th of July. And yeah, we'll see everyone later on this week in the Lounge. Have yourselves a fantastic rest of your Monday. And even though he's not here, I'm still going to say it. Mr. Hound, roll that beautiful bean footage.
Hey, way of the road. We'll see you guys next time.